I'm Jonathan Tomlinson, the Assistant Director of the Institute. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all this evening to the Canadian Institute in Greece, for the second event in this academic year. This evening I have the pleasure of introducing an old friend, Professor Craig Hardiman. Craig holds a B.Commerce in Marketing and a BA in Classics, both from Concordia University, and an MA in Classics from the University of Western Ontario. In 2005, he was awarded a PhD in art history from the Ohio State University for a dissertation entitled The Nature of Hellenistic Domestic Sculpture in its Cultural and Spatial Contexts. Craig held a fellowship here at the Canadian Institute in 2003 to 4, and since 2005 was taught at the University of Waterloo, where he is now Associate Professor of Classical Studies and Director of the Waterloo Institute for Hellenistic Studies. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Institute in Greece. Craig specialises in Hellenistic art and archaeology, especially in the domestic sphere, and he's currently editing a volume on interior decoration for Bloomsbury. Craig is also interested in the reception of classics and pop culture, and especially in video games, having recently taught several undergraduate courses on the subject, and it is on this topic that he will speak to us this evening. Craig.
How about we eschew this and I will project as best I can. Thank you, Dr. Tomlinson, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming out this evening. It's greatly appreciated. It's not been 20 years since I last gave a talk for SIG, but it's been about 20 years since I gave a talk as part of the Institute's regular lecture program, where I talked about my dissertation and did all the usual things you're supposed to do in these kinds of talks and go over material culture and archaeology and new interpretations of data and all that sort of thing. Well, that's not happening this evening. Tonight, I want to talk about something that's a little bit more light, perhaps in the festive season as we move forward. Dare I say, it's perhaps a little bit more fun as well in some ways. But it's also something that I've been really interested in for a little while now. It's based partially off of a piece I wrote in the Canadian Institute newsletter fairly recently. I'm going to expand on what I put there. It's also coming from my experience in a classroom. So for the past several years, as Dr. Tomlinson said, I've been teaching a course on classics and pop culture, video games, comic books, movies, etc. And last year, I actually taught an undergraduate seminar specifically on classics and video games. So these experiences where I gathered information from students, my own interest, all of these sorts of things, is going to form the core of my presentation this evening and have some of the questions that I wish to pose. Well, as for where all of this kind of thing started, there's kind of two avenues. As Jonathan said, I'm very much interested in decoration and materials on display in ancient houses. And so, because I teach at a very tech university, at some point I looked into the possibility of doing some sort of 3D recreation, VR recreation of a Greek house. You could then wear one of those augmented reality headsets and wander around it and experience things as they would have been. I soon realized this was going to be fairly impossible for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not that sophisticated when it comes to technology. Two, I don't really have the publishing rights to any of these kinds of things. But perhaps most importantly, I didn't have a grant worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to put something like that together. Those were all very annoying reasons why I couldn't do this. It was all the more annoying because as professional teachers, we're often encouraged to gamify the classroom. So gamification can mean lots of things, from creating fun board games to using actual video games as teaching tools. But the basic idea is that students learn better when aspects of gameplay, development, reward, loot systems, these kinds of things, are used as opposed to traditional lecturing styles of teaching. Now, while various studies have been done to illustrate this, that this can be both good and bad in the classroom, the use of video games, which is essentially what I kind of wanted to do with a VR of an ancient Greek home, using these things as a teaching tool intrigued me. It also, as I thought about this stuff, made me think of my own history with video games. Perhaps not surprisingly for those who know me, I was a fairly early adopter of video games as an entertainment medium when they began to be a thing in the mid to late 1970s. I believe it was Christmas 1980, I think, when I asked for and got one of the original Atari 2600s, with its, how's this for specs, 8-pixel sprites, 40-pixel playfield graphics, 60 frames per second gameplay, and 128 possible colors. Oh, I was blown away. I was captivated, and I played Space Invaders, Pitfall, Adventure, etc., until I got carpal tunnel from the joystick. So I've been playing video games for over 40 years, and it's important not to prove how hip I am with the youths and their video games, but basically to illustrate that video games have been using the ideas and themes of classical culture, history, myths, and narrative techniques in one way or another for just as long. Be it classical, Near Eastern, Mesoamerican, or any sort of ancient culture, ancient archaeology, basically thoughts of adventure, finding things, exotic locales, etc. All of these have been present in video games. There are lots of things I could talk about, one or two I'll touch on briefly, but for the most part, I'm going to talk about issues of archaeology, material culture, and just what kinds of questions should we be asking ourselves about using these sorts of games in the classroom and beyond. Now, I freely admit that I have not done the most exhaustive search for this. I've done a lot of searching, but as near as I can tell, the first video game to allude to the classics was 1982's Atlantis. Now, this game had absolutely nothing to do with the classical world, as you simply are repelling invaders from space from destroying your city. So it was very much a Space Invaders knockoff on what you were doing. But I suppose there is something there that could be done about the ways in which the Atlantis myth has been misused over the millennia. You can find lots of material online for that if you'd like. The earliest game that I could find with a very specific reference to classics is 1984's Hercules. You can see him here wearing his famous medieval fantasy armor. Now, with the actual gameplay that you have down here, there's Hercules, you can see that what he does is he just sort of jumps from platform to platform in order to get to the end goal for his 12 labors, in this case, the Nemean lion up here. All fairly simple, but this was 1984. It may be a bit goofy as well, but again, it illustrates that ancient Greece, unsurprising with its mythology, history, cast of characters, has been a component of video game content from the genre's outset. Now, the same can be said for issues of archaeology. Not surprisingly, among the first games to feature archaeological content was a game tied in to the very first Indiana Jones movie. Indiana Jones is the archaeologist paradigm in modern pop culture, and so it was that he appeared in the first console archaeology game, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, I will be perfectly honest, I have no idea what's going on here in terms of gameplay and what you're supposed to do, but essentially there were puzzles that you had to solve, magic items to find, and other things to make this a kind of action-adventure kind of game. This particular game gathered fairly mixed reviews, but was generally seen as inferior to its main competitor, Pitfall. In this game, you play as Pitfall Harry, an adventurer who has to travel through jungles, avoid traps like quicksand and scorpions, and collect lost treasure. The implication is that you're an archaeologist treasure hunter somewhere in South America, and the whole thing very much seems to be a version of that opening scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana steals the idol in South America. He avoids the boulders and swings over things with his whip. Right? And so, same thing here with Pitfall Harry. You can see that archaeology, then, may be slightly misrepresented if none of these games have you actually toiling away in the hot sun in a trench full of potsherds. Not sure how fun that would be, but still, it does show a version of archaeology that has been part of video games since its inception. And yet, with all of this production for over 40 years, unlike film, novels, or other forms of communication that have been the subject of numerous scholarly works for decades, the study of video games as a vehicle for classical reception and archaeology is only in its infancy. While there have been a few articles here and there written over the years, it was only with the arrival of Andrew Reinhardt's Archaeogaming in 2018 that scholars began to look at video games more in depth. Reinhardt, who I think is still a doctoral student, I don't think he's graduated just yet, but a doctoral student at the University of York, has since become synonymous with the fields of material culture in gaming, though the book is more about issues of archaeology and history in video games and the perceptions about archaeology as a discipline. He does, however, discuss in his book one interesting intersection of video games and archaeology, and that's the section where he discusses the very famous ET dig. Anybody know what this is? Good. Okay. Largely considered one of, if not the, worst video game of all time, Atari's ET was so convoluted, poor, and deficient in every single aspect of gameplay that it was a financial disaster for the company that would eventually lead to the dissolution of Atari as a company in 1984. As early as 1983, Atari supposedly dumped several truckloads of unsold or returned cartridges into a New Mexico landfill. But urban legend began to crop up as to whether this actually happened, what games were done, was it all encased in cement, etc. Records were lost, and so in 2016, Reinhardt and a few other people were asked to perform an excavation in the old landfill and see what they could find. Lo and behold, they found a series of the lost mythical buried game cartridges, perhaps bringing the worlds of archaeology and video games together as they never had been before. The whole dig was the subject of an award-winning documentary called Atari Game Over, and one of the excavated ET cartridges is now on permanent display in the Smithsonian Institute. I would certainly recommend for anybody interested looking at Andrew Reinhardt's webpage, archaeogaming.com. There he also has a blog post, he's got podcasts, etc. And he does a really good job of looking at the way in which archaeology is represented in a number of these games. Now, aside from Reinhardt, we still had to wait a little bit more before sort of typical disciplinary volumes on classics and video games were published. The collection of essays on the left, Classical Antiquity in Video Games, deals more with the images, impacts, and receptions of the classical world as major themes in games, while Ross Clare's Ancient Greece and Roman Video Games attempts at creating more of a proper methodology for such investigations. Both of these volumes fill an important gap in the realm of classical reception studies, as well as look to form something of an interdisciplinary bridge between classical reception and historical game studies. Beyond these reception studies, the impact that gaming can have on the discipline of classics as a pedagogical tool has only fairly recently been considered as well. It was in 2017 in a Society for Classical Studies blog post that David Frederick, an associate professor of classics at the University of Arkansas, posed the question, what can classics do with video games? In this, he discussed how he's been using technologies as a teaching tool in general for years, describing how as far back as 2004, he had students in, of all things, an Ovid seminar, use free online software to design a Roman house based on Ovidian poetry. But he also wanted to look specifically at how these things can be used for educational purposes. So he and his team at the university developed a game called Cyculum. This game is designed to be used as a course for introduction to Roman civilization. Not in a course, but as a course itself. In this game, you immerse yourself into the lives of the gens Fulvii and play through events from the time of Hannibal to late antiquity. Elements of the gameplay were designed as educational, such as a combat system meant to teach about Roman warfare and violence, a debate system that's meant to teach you about Roman oratory, and a client management system that's meant to explore the patron-client relationship. Have a look and see what you think.
There you are, Fulvia. Over here and speak with your old grandmother. There are matters we must discuss. As you can see, our family has many who contributed to its growth, its glory, survival. Before you settle on this path you have chosen, I feel you must first know what you would be throwing away.
Assembly of the people. Rome finds itself amidst a crisis.
Think about it. We are some of the most respected people in Rome now.
Am I the gossip of all Rome again?
What does the Lithium tell you?
I have a reputation, remember?
You belong to Rome, and Rome belongs to me.
Why are you telling me this?
To educate you.
There's a great deal of frustration in me on this.
I heard about your promotion. Augustus must really see something in here.
You should leave the town's patronage to those who deserve.
Being pride, that's not exactly the taking news. We have our action here. I seem to finally be getting through to you, young Folia. I am a vestal priestess of Rome.
I owe you nothing. Where's your loyalty?
So you feel like I didn't mean for this before.
Do you realize what you've done?
Family overall, Titus, that's what matters.
This is what our republic has been reduced to now. One day to the next. I will
Anyway, those are the trailers for these things that you can find on YouTube. Well, this pedagogical use is, I think, a recognition of the power of video games have as a genre. They are in-depth, they are interactive, they have strong narrative engagement, and so their analysis as vehicles for classics in general and archaeology is fairly obvious, as I think is in general the reason you would do so. The video game industry is the single largest entertainment industry across the globe. Video gaming, including home consoles, so Xbox and PlayStation, PC, portable gaming such as on your phone, became the largest genre of consumed entertainment in the US in 2007 and in the rest of the world by 2010. The most recent numbers I could find were from 2017, and in that year, video game sales did over $100 billion globally. Compare that to roughly $95 billion for book sales, $60 billion for music sales, and $40 billion for movies. You can see that video games are really not the niche market for nerds that some still take it to be. Again, these are not the most accurate data that you can find, but from various industry lists and compilations, there are hundreds of video games that have some foundation in classical antiquity, be they large-scale productions from huge gaming development companies or from small independent studios. RPGs, or role-playing games where you play as a character, RTS, real-time strategy games where you pit armies against each other, platformers where you jump from one platform to another, puzzlers, etc. All of these are found within these lists. To date, I have found 86 games set in the ancient Greece, 56 games set in ancient Rome, and 12 set in the Byzantine period. This is to say nothing of the numerous games set in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and other cultures. Now these numbers reflect games that are tied very directly to classical antiquity. One can, I think, stretch the influence of classics in gaming narratives as part of the overall Western European storytelling tradition. And this has been done numerous times in numerous ways with reception studies. But broadly, I think the kinds of games that you can look at with having this sort of content can fall into three rather broad categories. The first kind of classical influence in games, I think, is fairly general or generic. I would see this as a kind of inspiration, but not a direct representation in any way of classical antiquity. This could be anything from taking ideas from a Greek play and turning it into a futuristic space shoot-'em-up game. This could be just using things like monsters or architecture or other generic elements that may even have been received via another medium. A good example of a game that is, I think, inspired by classical antiquity rather than based on it would be something like World of Warcraft. Warcraft, or WoW, as it's known, is a hugely popular game that is played worldwide by millions of people. The game has several basic elements that can be considered as inspired by classical antiquity, ranging from creatures to stories and narratives typical of ancient storytelling, not the least of which are elements of the so-called hero journey made famous by Odysseus. WoW is what's called a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that is set within a fantasy world, but the game also has elements of steampunk, sci-fi, and various other kinds of genres. The first game was released in 2004 and has had several updates and add-ons since then, and although membership has fluctuated over the years, still about 10 million people play the game worldwide. In the game, you create a character, you choose a race such as dwarf or elf, and a class such as wizard or warrior, and then you go online to play the game in a giant open world campaign. You then level up your character, and in leveling them up, you become more powerful, you get more powerful gear. If this sounds a lot like playing Dungeons & Dragons, that's on purpose. You cannot underestimate the importance that Dungeons & Dragons had on so many elements of these kinds of video games. I will not go into detail about those connections here, but at the very least, you can think of something like Dungeons & Dragons and how Greco-Roman mythology, hero journeys, monsters, etc. Have been so integrated into that kind of a game. And a number of these video games then take those elements directly or indirectly from Dungeons & Dragons. So what material in WoW is classical exactly? Well, it's most obviously seen in the creatures that inhabit the game, the monsters and the characters that you're going to meet. I'll give just two very brief examples. When you're creating your character, you can decide to choose the race as a tauren, aka a minotaur, just like a race like elf or human or whatever. I think it's interesting just because this then flips the sort of traditional hero-monster dichotomy on its head. You can also encounter monstrous creatures, such as these harpies, seen here as slightly more avian than their ancient Greek counterparts. But these characters populate a world that has a definite classical feel. But this also extends to elements like architecture. Though several architectural styles are present in the game, including made-up fantastical ones, classical architecture plays its part. Take the most generic of buildings, the ancient Greek temple, here seen in the most atypical example of a Greek temple in the Parthenon. But you can see echoes of these sorts of things inhabiting the world. So here is a location from the game, and I think you can see clearly the form of a Greek temple up here. So these kinds of architectural forms inhabit these worlds. Now, one of the better examples of this kind of architectural use isn't from Warcraft at all, but I should mention it just briefly because it's so often used in pieces associated with video games and archaeology. The Nabatean site of Petra, ancient Rakhmul in southern Jordan, is an incredibly important site related to the height of the Nabatean cultures in the late 1st century CE. Famous among archaeologists for its numerous buildings and clever use of scarce water resources. It's also famous in the public imagination for the picturesque nature of the treasury, the mausoleum. Here, it's old, it's dramatic, it survives relatively well, but is still kind of clearly a ruin. And so, it became kind of ubiquitous in various entertainment media as an architectural form associated with, quote-unquote, archaeology. It perhaps has no more famous cameo than, again, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where it showed up as the location for the Holy Grail. In video games, it probably most famously showed up in 2015's game, Rise of the Tomb Raider. You can see here the actual treasury more easily in terms of the artist's rendition here, or the concept art for the game. It's slightly reimagined in the game itself, but the references are still pretty clearly there. So this then mirrors the use of Greek architecture in World of Warcraft. But since we're talking about Tomb Raider, I should make a pause within my pause and sort of talk for a minute about the main character of the Tomb Raider series, Lara Croft, and how these games may, at best, be considered by or inspired by archaeology. While Indiana Jones may well be the most famous entertainment archaeologist, in the world of video games, no one stands above Lara Croft. First appearing in 1996's Tomb Raider, Lara Croft has gone on to become an icon, appearing in almost 20 games in over 20 years, in addition to 3 movies. The Tomb Raider games have been hailed as seminal in forming what people consider the modern action-adventure video game. The main character, Lara, is an archaeologist, traveling the world to solve puzzles and finding objects often associated with various mythologies. While fun, her character presents several problems. While some have hailed her as a feminist hero, a woman of both action and intellect, it is the character's design and her overt sexualization in the game's advertising that has led some to be more critical. Recent games and treatments have tried to downplay this aspect of her character, even making her a PhD student in the game Rise of the Tomb Raider. And so while I was a PhD student here at the Canadian Institute, my life was nowhere near as exciting as Lara's was, and so I blame the administration. But anyway, what they don't downplay in these games is the action. Croft's world of archaeology is all about looting, violence, murder, and a whole host of skills that, shockingly, they don't teach you as a PhD student. Like Indiana Jones, Lara Croft is presented as an archaeologist, but in fact, archaeology, or perhaps more appropriately, knowledge of ancient cultures, seems to just be a skill she possesses, much like stealth, weapon usage, parkour, rather than an occupation itself. So archaeology clearly has an image problem, even if this means everyone who tells that you're an archaeologist automatically thinks you're a badass. But thankfully, things may be changing. A far more positive representation of a female archaeologist appears in the game Heaven's Vault, published by Inkle Studios. In the game, you play an archaeologist called Aliyah Elasra, who, along with her robot friend, sail between the moons of Nebula. Along the way, you find a series of inscriptions at sites, or you go to excavations where you have to translate the material you find from the quote-unquote language of the ancients. This is a far more sedate version of what it means to be an archaeologist, but it does present actual archaeological activities, and the game does use techniques that are used in modern epigraphical studies. This is obviously a fiction, although I sometimes wonder with the advent of technology, we'll probably have robots in trenches fairly soon. So this is an invention, but it presents this sort of slightly more progressive view of archaeology and archaeologists, and asks the player to actually think about things in a way an archaeologist actually might. These then are examples of games that use elements of material culture, fictional accounts of archaeology, or even mythological creatures in order to have what I might consider window dressing when it comes to our knowledge of the past and how they flavor these games. The second kind of game category that I might suggest are ones that are based on our knowledge of antiquity, but may often have sort of fantastical elements or a premise that takes it out of actual antiquity or outside the real world proper. More than just window dressing, these games may be set in ancient Greece or ancient Rome and thus need to use our historical and archaeological knowledge to create the worlds, even if the world is ultimately fictional. A good example of this kind of game is God of War. Among the most successful game franchises of all time, the God of War series began at the same time as World of Warcraft, but unlike that online game, this was developed solely for the home console market. The first God of War game was released in 2005 as a PlayStation 2 exclusive. It was immediately hailed as a massive success and won several Game of the Year awards. This would necessarily lead to a series of sequels and side games, all of which were seen as largely successful additions to the game's mythos. In this game, you play as the warrior Kratos, seen here in all of his mean, tattooed, badass, muscled glory. He's sort of the personification of strength, as you might suggest. A warrior without peer, one against whom none can stand, so only a slight male fantasy. Now, according to interviews with the game's producers, they did take the name Kratos from the Greek, but they had no actual knowledge of the god Kratos, son of Pallas and Styx, first mentioned in Hesiod's Theogony, and fully fleshed out in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. Both character and god, however, are merciless, pitiless, and given this background, you are, of course, Spartan. While I won't go into it, happy to answer some questions afterwards, this is yet another representation of Spartans being used in pop culture in a massively oversimplified way. Think of something like 300. So why is Kratos so angry? Well, it turns out that Ares tricked you into killing your wife and daughter. With the help of Athena, you manage to kill Ares and assume the mantle of God of War. But you don't stop there. You confront all of the other gods, take them on, and with the help of the Titans, you assault Mount Olympus. So that was the game trailer you saw as you were coming in. In the end, the Titans betray you, you kill Zeus, and fed up with the whole lot, you leave the world without any gods. So a nice uplifting story. Now the gods are of course present in the game as you fight them, whether these are in fact the elder gods, so you might recognize these from the trailer, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. The younger gods show up, so Ares, Athena, and Hephaestus. And even heroes, mythological warriors, and creatures all inhabit the game. All of these characters, however, all of them, are presented as monsters. Individuals of immense power that don't care for humans and use mortals as chess pieces for their amusement. Kratos himself is hardly a sympathetic figure. Sure, he was tricked into killing his family, but he is presented as a murdering psychopath in the game whose only motivation in life is revenge. So the whole story, in a way, turns into something of a Greek tragedy in the sort of modern popular sense, but also maybe in the ancient Greek sense. The story within each game is presented very much as an Aristotelian three-act concept. Elements such as pathos and catharsis are invoked, either explicitly in the story or in the minds of the players. And the game invites us to ask, towards the end, if a murdering psychopath can engender pathos at all. One can think of numerous characters from Greek myth and drama who themselves are murderous and or commit atrocities, even if under the influence of the gods. There are definite links to Euripides' Hercules' Furens and possibly Sophocles' Ajax in this game, but I like to think of this in more of an Aeschylean way, with issues of murder and morality present in the Oresteia. The whole series ends with a world without gods, and all along the game questions the nature and role of the gods. We can perhaps think of Euripides and his famous questioning of religion in 5th century Athens. I think then you can see a general pattern of classical inspiration in the game. It's obvious in a world of Greek gods, myths, and setting, but I think you can stretch this a little bit more into senses of classical narrative and storytelling, and this well illustrates this second category. Games with a definitive classical inspiration, but presenting a fantastical version of antiquity with little basis in history. The third and last category of game is one that is directly set in or based on classical antiquity. Here you play during a time period or an event that could be real or imagined, but is recognizably from history. These games, more than any other, rely on our historical and archaeological knowledge not just to populate their worlds, but to do so in a manner that makes the game feel as if you're in the ancient world. I'm going to look at 2 games in the same series for this final category, a series that is perhaps now the most famous in the world of classical studies and ancient archaeology, Assassin's Creed. Much like God of War, Assassin's Creed is a well-established franchise with many related games, sequels, and prequels under its belt. Unlike God of War, Assassin's Creed games have always tried to have a strong historical component to them, and often tout their games as being historically accurate within the framework of a fictionalized game. The game itself is an action-oriented role-playing game that first came out in 2007. Developed by French and Canadian company Ubisoft, there's our Canadian content for the evening, the first Assassin's Creed met with similar critical and commercial acclaim as God of War. The game's conceit is that there is this eternal war between the assassins, who are the good guys, and the Knights Templar, who are the bad guys. The overall sort of backstory is pretty convoluted. It deals with aliens, evil corporations, and genetic memory. I'm going to ignore all of that and just concentrate on the sort of historicity of the games. Now, as you can see from the list, everything from the Third Crusade to Victorian England has been covered as the times and places where this struggle between the two groups occur. Certainly these games are hugely popular as they have sold over 100 million copies. One reason is for the stunning and often painstakingly realistic graphics. Just to give you an idea, here are a few famous images and monuments that have cropped up in these games. So you have, again, going back to 2007, so keep that in mind for graphics. But here you've got the Dome of the Rock, Hagia Sophia, and Notre Dame Cathedral. And as anyone who has played these games know, these are not mere buildings in the distance, but fully explorable and climbable structures inside and out. For our purposes, there are 2 games that are germane to our interests, and I will take them chronologically from when the games appeared. The first is 2017's Assassin's Creed Origins. After taking a few years off from the franchise, Ubisoft decided to stop telling the overall story chronologically and went back in time to explore the roots of this conflict between the Assassins and the Templars. The fact that the game developers decided to use ancient Egypt as a setting for this, with its rich history and numerous alien conspiracy theories, should be of little surprise. But what might be, however, is that the game is not set in the Old or Middle Kingdom, but rather during the Ptolemaic Age. In the game, you play as Bayek, a native Egyptian and member of the Magi. This group of elite warriors is perhaps best known from the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, but it was an historical organization, sort of like a police force, between the 18th and 20th dynasties. This game is set between the years of 49 and 47 BCE, and you work, quote-unquote, for the people of Egypt during the dynastic struggles of Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra VII. So at times you can work for the Ptolemaic house and at times against it. There's a lot of historical material in this game. Places, events, battles, and people that we have in the historical record. Again, I'm going to concentrate on the material side of things, but you could go through it and unpack historical and literary sources and tropes as well. There is, for example, a lot of interaction in the game between Caesar and Cleopatra. While the dialogue and interactions are naturally fictional, you can see a number of historical sources at use in the depictions of Caesar and Cleopatra, especially those pro-Roman ones that present Caesar as a strong and decisive leader and Cleopatra as sexy and luxurious. Still, you can argue about the use of pro-Roman sources in the game, but the depiction is still predicated on actual ancient sources. And Ubisoft did a fairly good job in its historical research, especially with its environs and locations. Look at the city of Alexandria, for example. The lighthouse, the library, the tomb of Alexander the Great, the Serapeion. These and many more locations have been painstakingly restored and can be visited and interacted with in the game. So how did Ubisoft go about this research? Well, the company began by sending teams of designers, writers, and producers to sites like Alexandria and Athens to get an overall feel for the architecture and sense of what a Hellenistic Greco-Egyptian world might look like. Wanting to go even further than this, the team hired Dr. Evelyne Ferron, a lecturer at the Université de Sherbrooke in Canada, who is an archaeologist and a specialist in Egyptology. As you can see from this quote, for 2 years she gave a series of presentations and source materials to the Ubisoft team, but didn't just look at history and architecture, she looked at issues of climate, flora and fauna, food, clothing, entertainment, all of this to create a world in which you feel like you are immersed in an actual Hellenistic city. It's actually odd, at one point when you finally get to Alexandria in the game, and you just hear people talking in the background, they're actually speaking a rather odd mix of ancient and modern Greek in their pronunciations. So it's interesting. The creators were understandably proud of these achievements, more so because they found many professionals interested in using this world as a teaching tool. Now, numerous websites and projects exist that have been created by academics in attempts to digitally recreate singular monuments or whole archaeological sites or cities. Okay, this is what I wanted to do at the beginning. Just 2 quick examples. A site like flyoverzone.com recreates Rome. Here you can see the rostrum in Rome form. But often in these sorts of things, you can only do a fly-through of these reconstructions. You can't really fully immerse yourself in the location and wander in and out of these buildings. Another project, for example, is the recently announced cooperation between Microsoft and the Greek government for the digital recreation of ancient Olympia. But that's going to mostly be about VR, AR, virtual reality, augmented reality presentations. And it does present certain technological barriers to entry. And one can always question its academic rather than its public educational effectiveness. Still, many professors thought, why should I try recreating these worlds when I can't get a grant anywhere near Ubisoft's budget to create my own models? The industry is really tight-lipped about what budgets these games have, but what are generally considered AAA titles, so the big names like Assassin's Creed, they can have budgets of anywhere between $100 and $500 million. So again, put that up against any grant agency. So, why not use this kind of game as a teaching aid as one attempts to gamify the classroom? Well, Ubisoft had this in mind where they developed a mode in the game called Discovery Tour, where you can turn off the game elements and just have your character wander around and learn about buildings, people, and events without pesky individuals running up and trying to get you to do silly things like go find them apples or whatever. So again, here's a video from YouTube where Ubisoft talking about the Discovery mode.
In Assassin's Creed, traditionally, there is, yes, an action component, which is very important, but there is also a very contemplative aspect.
In the Discovery Tour, we really wanted to focus the main experience on discovering and learning.
And all of a sudden, you're not in the game anymore. You're just in Egypt, enjoying it, and looking at the world like never before.
It started off in 2014. A lot of professors were contacting us saying, hey, you know what, it would be amazing if you could do a mode, a dedicated mode for us, so that we could use that into classrooms. It's been in our mind ever since. We were thinking like, all right, how can we make the game different? Something that would be interesting for students, but also that would be interesting for our players.
The idea is to be able to share the entire world without heavy narrative or file control that would be a barrier. And we just let you enjoy the entire world, but keeping the interactivity of the game, which is, I think, very important for such a tool. So, in addition to explore the entire world, we decided to add more than 75 tours that are thematically friendly. Most of the tours will be about the architecture, the people, the way of life. But we have also very specific stations that are clearly identified, where we will try to tell more about our development process so that people understand a bit better the development of video games.
With the Discovery Tour, we can be proactive about the information that we give, understanding that sometimes it's just artistic liberty, where we raise a little bit the pyramids so that you see them from afar. But the dimensions of the pyramid are actually true, and the way that we build it is actually based on all the knowledge that we have at the moment. very early on, we knew that something that was interesting was to have external point of view on what we're doing. So to have a scientist and his team doing an external research on our product is great.
On est celui qui décide ce qu'on fait, on pense, on est impliqué dans l'action, on est engagé. En plus de même, parce que c'est intéressant et beau, on est engagé parce qu'on doit prendre des décisions. Et si on regarde tous les détails, si on a quelqu'un qui nous guide pour les voir en plus, on maximise l'apprentissage. Ça veut dire qu'un élève laissé à lui-même, à la maison, en faisant le tour d'idées, apprendrait beaucoup de choses, sans même se faire dire « tu dois apprendre ceci ».
They reconstructed a world that doesn't exist anymore. Because when we teach, we try to help them to be immersed in that kind of environment, but to see it at the same time. That's something brand new for the teachers and really helpful, because students, I think, will remember more what we teach if they can feel it.
We are really here to say, you know what, video games can bring more than pure entertainment. I'm really happy about the quantity and the quality of things that we're bringing to the people so that they can actually enjoy and really learn about ancient Egypt.
So, what do you think? Would this be helpful? Would this be good for students in a classroom? Well, luckily, we don't necessarily have to think. A test was done to find out. And two groups were taught the same material. One via standard lecturing and the other via the game, and then were given identical tests and asked to recall certain details. The average scores for these retention tests for people taught via lecture was 54% and 44% in the video game. Scores that make you wonder how effective big commercial games are as a teaching tool. What happens, for example, when a company sacrifices historical reality for better visuals or better gameplay, as they suggested? Now, as someone who plays video games, this makes me happy. I want it to be an enjoyable experience. But as a teacher, it can frustrate me when there are things that are so obviously incorrect that I know someone somewhere is playing this game and taking it in as fact. What are the intersections of history, gameplay, education, and fun? Does a for-profit company like Ubisoft have any responsibility when it produces a quote-unquote historically accurate game beyond sales and shareholder price? Is this essentially the next logical step in for-profit education and teaching? These games are often the very first interaction young people have with the ancient world. How do you correct anything in the moment that a student may think is how things really were when they're just at home sitting on their couch eating Cheetos and killing Roman soldiers? I am not saying that the game is full of faults. It is in fact wonderful. But historical accuracy and the need to have good, commercially successful gameplay might be mutually exclusive end goals, especially when the company itself touts the educational value of the game. To look at just a few quick examples, you walk around Egypt and you might stop at stalls selling canopic jars, ushabti figurines, ankhs, and other accurately portrayed goods. You can walk into a temple and see famous pieces of art from the classical past, such as this Apollo Kytheroidos. You can walk into people's homes and see 2nd and 3rd style Roman painting, such as this example from the Villa Ferracina. You can even see material more rightly belonging to the Gabinetto Segreto. At one point you wander into someone's home and the game has very accurately portrayed actual erotic scenes from various locations in Pompeii. You can even just walk around the environment and marvel at historically accurate landscapes. I love this particular screenshot. In the game, this is just outside the city of Cyrene, and shows fields covered in silphium, the now extinct vegetable herb that comes from the alum family. Famous for its silphium, Cyrene was called silphium bearing, laser viciferus by Catullus, and images of the famed crop appeared on coins of the city. This all shows a painstaking attention to detail, but it then makes some of the visual gaffes all the more jarring. You wander around Alexandria and you come across what is clearly a copy of the Pantheonic frieze from the Parthenon. Okay, you can suggest that this was such a seminal work, it was heavily copied, etc., but it still seems rather odd. Odder still is this vase of olive workers that you see throughout the game. I understand you cannot model every individual vase in the game, and so repetition is to be expected. But this amphora is one that we actually have in the record. It's fairly famous, it's in the British Museum, and it actually dates to 520 BCE. So how an amphora from Attica made its way to Egypt and lasted almost 500 years might be a question you have to answer to students. Even more remarkable is this rather unassuming table, where you have to read a letter on the table as part of the quest. Yep, you will notice that the ostracon of Cimon, son of Miltiades from 461, is just hanging out on this table in the middle of nowhere, Egypt. Now, obviously, this is done as a so-called Easter egg surprise elements in the game that is meant to delight the player, but you still have to wonder what was sort of in the designer's minds with some of these things. To finish, I think the same could be said for the game's prequel that surprisingly came out the following year, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. No one was really expecting this game to come out so soon, much less how much of a wave this would cause in the field of classics. The game is set during the Peloponnesian War, and you play as a Greek mercenary, and so you fight for or against Athens or Sparta. You have, as you see, a whole host of famous people that show up in the game, and by far this game takes classically situated premises for a video game to a whole nother level. With the success of Origins, Ubisoft hired a permanent in-house historian, Stephanie Anruata, a Roman history specialist with a PhD in classics from the Université de Nantes, and this game blew up, and suddenly it was on every blog, every public classicist, every gaming site was talking about this game, its historical depth, its relationship to Thucydides, the portrayal of archaeological veracity, etc. The depth of work and historical accuracy was massive. And like Origins, a lot of this was geared towards learning possibilities through that discovery mode, which they kept for this game. How is this? Well, so much so that no less a figure than John Camp, director of the excavations in the Athenian Agora, has used this mode for discussing what the ancient Agora actually looked like. If you want, you can Google the American School's virtual gala from 2021, where Dr. Camp narrates a walkthrough of the Agora from the game. But yet again, you have the same issues of historical accuracy, repeated forms, and questionable choices. In terms of historical accuracy, there's much to be admired in the reconstructions of Bronze Age structures. Take here the Lion Gate at Mycenae. And yet, as you travel to Mycenaean citadels all over Greece in the game, everything is actually decorated in Minoan art, as if the two cultures were conflated. There's really no need to do this, as you can see from this famous afterlife. That's a decoration. Obviously, it's the bull jumping fresco from Knossos, but this is in Mycenae in the game. But yeah, you have things like the afterlife fresco for Mycenae, and so I don't know why they do this. You get several quests that involve mysterious Bronze Age writing that has nothing to do with linear A or B, which is actually never discussed. You even sort of get a little bit of archaeological discovery. This guy here, it's a 20-second video, I'll just skip over it. But basically he presents himself as an archaeologist in the game and wants you to go do things for historical purposes. Athens is beautifully rendered within the game and fully explorable, but as you can tell, several buildings here just didn't exist. In terms of repeated forms, here's an inscription that appears over and over and over again. In the game, you would think it was the only inscription the ancient Greeks ever wrote, which is odd because it is actually a sacred inscription from the Asclepios Sanctuary at Epidaurus about a boy whose eyes were healed by being licked by a dog. Questionable choices around. While Pausanias states that the Odeon of Hercules was meant to, quote, copy Xerxes' tent, I'm not sure that it was supposed to look like the Ishtar Gate or Persepolis as it does here. The island of Delos is presented as a lush and verdant landscape, where for those of us who have been know that it's a barren and bleak landscape, famous in antiquity even for its lack of water. The game certainly has more going for it than against it, and it is just a wonderful experience to walk around and see the world of classical Greece recreated. Everything from details like the actual polychromy on statues and buildings is present in the game. They include, for example, if you go up to the Acropolis in the game, they include the spolia from the Persian sack of Athens. So the details are quite beautiful. But again, sometimes they can be beautiful and problematic. If you go to Epidaurus in the game, the Themelae is beautifully rendered, and it's fantastic. I love details, and I use these in various courses. Things like the capstan that they have for lifting the blocks. But again, do we care that this building post-dates the time period of the game by 80 years? You can get a sense in this game of everyday activities. At one point you have quests involving the great sculptor Phidias, and so you have to go to his workshop in Athens, modeled on the workshop of Phidias in Olympia. You can see the process of marble sculpting in its many phases, by going into his workshop. Or you can just wander around and interact, for example, with women as they work at their looms and sell their goods. Even the historical characters that you meet and interact with, as fun as they are based on the source material. Socrates is just as annoying in the game as you would imagine he is in real life. So while all of this is to be lauded, enjoyed, and perhaps even used in a classroom setting, it does illustrate the difficulty of representing history, archaeology, and material culture in video games. As games become ever more real and immersive, as they continue to be the first contact people have with antiquity, and while companies officially tout the educational value of their games, what role does accuracy play in light of the overall enjoyment in storytelling? Does it really matter if this Hellenistic bronze, which was discovered in Rome, in the game sits in Olympia 3 times its actual size, 300 years before it was even created? Well, I leave that to you as you pick up your controllers, enter the worlds of ancient Rome and Greece, and see how much of the real classical world and real archaeology is reflected in these games. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm sure there are questions and comments. Right, start.
Excellent. Yeah.
The medium is different, and it might gain
Yes, next question.
people's attention more, but is it really any different than Ben-Hur? 1950s, early 60s? Really impressive.
Is social media different from sending a letter? That's the analogy that I would give. So those of us of a certain age, whether it was Asterix comic books or seeing Ben-Hur or anything along those lines, those might have excited us. But those come around every so often. You know, Ben-Hur shows up at Easter every year. Some people may or may not see it gathering around television, these sorts of things. Whereas these video games are so ubiquitous. I gave you ones that are sort of the big names that you would purchase or download into your computer or such. But thousands of free games on your phone, thousands of free games everywhere. It's the way in which these things are being consumed and what they are doing, supposedly, to introducing people to the ancient world that I think is different. So you're right in terms of, you know, how accurate is Ben-Hur, how accurate is Gladiator, or any movies or TV shows like that. But it's just the sheer volume and the way it is so omnipresent that I think makes the medium different in the way you're trying to interact with it.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk, and thank you to the Institute for bringing you here. I think they always do a great job of kind of grounding archaeology and broadening it out into broader culture, and this talk has been a perfect example of that. You mentioned the penetration of gaming vis-a-vis other forms of entertainment, and those very surprising, still surprising, statistics about just how globally in the United States, how its place exceeds, you know, film, music, literature. What can you say about that in the context of contemporary Greece? Whether gaming is as, you know, it reflects, if those stats reflect in contemporary Greece, and what else can you say about contemporary Greece and gaming and its contribution to gaming? You came closest when you talked about Microsoft and ancient Olympia, but what are the other contributions that you're seeing are being made?
One of the things that I think is interesting, okay, to answer your first question, I can answer that easily because I just don't know in terms of the numbers for contemporary Greeks and where video gaming plays. If you just look at international trends broken down by country, it would not surprise me if the numbers vary a little bit, but if it's not the #1 medium, it will likely soon overtake it. Certainly, again, it depends on how you define these things, but just look at the ubiquity of smartphones and people just playing little games there. It doesn't even have to be a computer or something like that. In terms of the second question, I do know that the government has recently put on a bit of a push in order to attract everything from digital nomads to high-tech companies, be it gaming companies or not. I think two things. One, initially for these kinds of things, Greece was used in much the same way it has been used in the past. Companies from outside the country would come in with their 3D digital scanners and everything else in order to scan these buildings and recreate them in their games. But the one benefit is, I think, when that really started to happen in the 2010s-ish, Greece and Greek material culture and the people who run it were in a much more personal, powerful situation. So even though you had outside companies coming in and doing this and kind of using the material, the Greek government was much more involved. Individual archaeologists here in Greece were much more involved hands-on. And I think that is going to springboard as we look forward. And you're going to start to see a lot more general tech companies. It may not be a gaming company. And again, one of the things is with a number of these companies, these big gaming companies, they're international anyway. They may have started in, Paris, but the people who do their motion capture are in Greece, and the people who do their sound engineering are in Edmonton, and the people, so it is a kind of international thing. I could certainly see that growing as an industry here as the government is trying to bring in these more technologically oriented sort of economic groups.
You mentioned the issue of accuracy. And I understand that being a professor, you worry about that stuff. Is there any possibility for institutions like international historical societies, etc., to exercise some control as to what is being put out? I'm not talking about doing censorship. I'm talking about emphasizing the accuracy issue.
I don't think that's being done in any large scale, like an overarching organization. I think many organizations would shy away from that. But individual historians or archaeologists who have their own web pages and blog posts and that kind of thing are discussing these issues. And I'll say right up front, I'm a gamer. I would much prefer the game to be fun than historically accurate. That's its purpose. However, when a company embeds an educational mode into its game and starts touting the educational possibilities, on the one hand, you have to look at these games in general and say, okay, in the pop culture sense, the Spartans are all running around naked and they all kick each other into pits and everything else. And okay, you have to bring students back from those preconceptions. But when it comes to those games that specifically are saying, we have an educational mode, then I think you can be a lot stricter in terms of what it is that they're presenting and how accurate it is. And so individuals, I think, are doing that in terms of keeping these companies honest, but so far no real organizations are doing that.
And another question, since these games are full of violence, for sure, and not only realistic violence, in other words, you kill someone but that person reappears. That person may not die after a bit. To what extent are there any studies showing the influence of games like this to the existence of violence among youth these days?
Most studies have shown that there's not a correlation. It is essentially the same, going back to Ben-Hur, it's the same arguments that heavy metal music is going to cause violence or anything else is going to cause violence. What I've certainly found among students teaching this kind of course over the past few years is they have a much more sophisticated way of compartmentalizing the things that are going on in the game so that they can actually revel in the violence. And they can say, oh, I chopped his head off and it was so cool when the blood spurted. but they compartmentalize that in a way that they understand that it is fun, it's not real life violence is bad. And certainly that's come out with the students that I've taught for these things over the years. So in as much as they can compartmentalize it, I think part of that is they grow up with violence, real world violence, or cartoon violence, or anything else all their lives. What they don't grow up with is enough of a sense of historical accuracy, especially related, in Canada, your history courses will revolve around Canadian history, maybe British North American history, that kind of thing. But you're not going to get taught anything about ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And so that's where the compartmentalization that they can do starts to fall down.
Well, I would like to ask you about one detail.
Yes?
Do you have an image of the Tomb of Alexander that was used in the game?
I can get one. I don't have one here. What they did for a number of those things was they generically created something.
Obviously they invented
Exactly.
it because we don't have it.
Exactly. And the key moment in the game that takes place in the Tomb of Alexander is that at one point you're doing so well as your character in helping people that Cleopatra becomes aware of you and wants you to help her. And the first time you meet her individually is she says, go meet me in the secret room of Alexander's tomb. And the one thing is that it is fantastical, but it is actually beautifully presented in terms of this sort of ancient Greek sort of pedestal that they've kind of encased it in glass, but not really, with the preserved body of Alexander in it, and there's an inscription and that kind of stuff. So it's entirely fantastical. I can easily find you an image of it.
I would love to see it.
Yes, but
does it look like a Macedonian tomb or like a pyramid? What does it look like?
It looks like it honestly looks like a generic Hellenistic round building.
Oh dear.
Yeah, is what it looks like. So I may be misremembering this, but I think the Apolokitharoidos that I showed, I think that was an acroterium on the tomb. So.
Any more questions or comments? If not, we can continue the discussion over a glass of wine in the next group. Thank you, Craig, again.